On Tuesday, the news broke that Qatar Airways was going to acquire 25% of Virgin Australia.
Guys, it's a really big deal.
We've seen this movie before.
In September, Etihad signed a new partnership with Virgin Blue to take on Qantas.
Is Virgin just a Trojan horse for the Middle Eastern airlines? Also, Qatar is part of oneworld, so why are they hopping into bed with Qantas's rival? Let's see what happened last time, explore why Qantas decided to go with Emirates in the first place, and what this whole Virgin-Qatar deal could look like in the future. What am I doing? I ask myself this every day. So let's start with what's actually happening with this proposed Qatar-Virgin deal. On Tuesday, Virgin Australia released a press release announcing that Qatar Airways was intending to purchase 25% of the company from Bain Capital for an undisclosed price. It's estimated now that it's probably around 700 million Australian dollars. Bain is looking to IPO Virgin Australia at around that 3 billion-ish mark, 3.5. As a part of this deal, Virgin Australia would also wet lease jets from Qatar Airways and begin flights to Doha from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth. First off, what's wet leasing? It's where an airline who's providing the jets also provides the pilots and the crew. So in this case, these flights to Doha will be sold by Virgin Australia, but they won't actually be operated by Virgin Australia cabin crew or pilots. My guess, the experience that you'll receive on these flights will be incredibly similar to a Qatar Airways flight. So why are they bothering to launch these flights under the Virgin Australia brand if they're essentially just Qatar Airways flights? Well, I guess it's sort of a clever workaround. It's a bit of a loophole on the current legal caps. Under the existing bilateral air service agreement between Qatar and Australia, Qatar Airways is only permitted to operate 28 flights per week. These air service agreements are bilateral, meaning that Qatari Airlines can operate 28 flights and Australian Airlines can operate 28 flights a week. Qatar is using all of their allotted slots, but Qantas and Virgin aren't flying to Doha at all, and so they're not using any of their 28. Now, this restriction is just on the 4 major Australian cities: Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth. They can fly to any other city as much as they like, and there are some extra allowances in the caps for if they want to operate sort of tag flights. That's why there's that really weird Adelaide to Melbourne Qatar flight, and they used to fly from Sydney to Canberra as well. But basically, Qatar Airways is limited to 28 flights a week to the 4 major Australian cities. You might be thinking, why is there a cap at all?
Why is this even a thing?
This is where it gets a bit complicated. Some countries have open skies agreements with Australia, such as Singapore, China, New Zealand, the United States, whilst others, like Qatar, have pretty tight limits on the number of flights that are allowed in every week. This is all pretty much a relic of the protectionist past when most of the world's airlines were government-owned. Last year, the Qatari government requested the Australian government to increase the caps. After much deliberation, Infrastructure and Transport Minister Catherine King denied the request, with the official reason being essentially that it's in the nation's best interests, whatever that means. Very broad, very non-specific, not very demure. It's been pretty widely reported that Qantas heavily lobbied against these increases to the Qatar caps. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has some fairly close ties with ex-Qantas CEO Alan Joyce. And while the entire government is a little bit influenced by the fact that they all get Chairman's Lounge access, if you don't know, Chairman's Lounge it's an invite-only level of status in Qantas, as well as exclusive lounges at a lot of the domestic airports in Australia. The only ways to get this are if you're the CEO of a company that has like a huge contract with Qantas, or if you're a federal minister. Pretty much all, I think all federal ministers get automatically invited once when they get elected. And so this is a way for Qantas to sort of sneakily have a bit of influence over the government. Apparently, for some reason, Anthony Albanese's son also got membership to the Chairman's Lounge, so definitely some close ties there. Another one of the sort of unofficial reasons cited in the media was with the forced examinations that occurred in October of 2020. I don't want to dive too deep here, I don't feel really qualified to talk about it, but I'll just sort of state the facts. It's kind of a terrible situation all around. A newborn baby was found in a bin in one of the women's restrooms at Doha's Hamad International Airport. In response, 10 flights were selected, and all of the women on board these flights, they were forced off the planes at gunpoint and then medically examined to see if they were the child's mother. A group of these women wrote to Catherine King when Qatar was applying for an increase to these caps, urging her to consider Qatar's insensitive and irresponsible treatment of their passengers. Regardless of the true reason, and it could be a big mix of all of them really, the request was denied, but Qatar still wanted to find a way to increase the number of flights that they could offer to Australia. There's a rumour, and hey, gossip can be a bit fun, that Qatar was trying to convince British Airways to operate a flight to Melbourne via Doha. Qatar owns 25% of IAG. This is the holding company that owns British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus, and a few others. So they have a bit of sort of control there and influence, but this didn't go ahead, clearly. And the Virgin Australia plan that's come about is clearly the plan that they're going with. Virgin Australia and Qatar have been in a code-sharing agreement since about the middle of 2022, though this wasn't exactly Qatar's first preference. Their ex-CEO, Akbar El-Baker, has stated, let me just get this right, that they've been trying to work with Qantas for a very long time, but realised that it wasn't going to happen due to Qantas' partnership with Emirates. Qantas and Emirates have been in a pretty long-term partnership now. It started in 2012. But I guess the question is, why did Qantas not end their partnership with Emirates? It was due to end after 10 years anyway, in 2022, and partner with Qatar instead. I think it's an interesting question. Both Qantas and Qatar are both in the One World Alliance. As I just said, Qatar owns a chunk of sort of British Airways, or the holding company of British Airways and a bunch of other airlines. They own chunks of Cathay Pacific. They basically own chunks of a bunch of Qantas's, maybe not friends, but allies. They're in one world. It would make a lot of sense for Qantas to jump ship and go and partner with Qatar. And while Qantas isn't as reliant on the Emirates network as it was in the past, they're now moving towards ultra long-haul flights, flying direct to places in Europe and the US, like New York, London, without stopping. So they don't need these sort of hubs in between. I don't think that's going to be the future of their network. So why did Qantas re-sign with Emirates? I think it comes down to the pretty strong relationship that Qantas and Emirates have built over the last 10 years. Why end a good thing when it's still good? This whole partnership has been hugely successful for both airlines, and I think it played a key role in saving Qantas's international arm back in 2012. I think it's actually worthwhile to dig into that a little bit. So let's quickly just jump back in time to figure out why Qantas originally hopped into bed with Emirates back in 2012.
Our story starts in the 90s. Qantas is privatised and the Australian government starts to open up the Australian skies, allowing more foreign airlines in to compete with Qantas and provide more options for Australians wanting to travel abroad. Globally too, aircraft technology is starting to develop at a rapid rate, and the introduction of the Boeing 777 particularly sees Emirates able to link any two places on Earth with a single stopover in Dubai. Emirates initially started flying to Australia in 1996 with a service to Melbourne. They weren't allowed to fly into Sydney until 2000 and had services to Brisbane and Perth by 2003. This was not without its issues though.
That sounds familiar.
Qantas heavily lobbied the government to limit the number of services allowed between the UAE and Australia, particularly in 2005 when Emirates was requesting for the caps to be doubled from 42 to 84 weekly flights. The government back then, after privatising Qantas, pushed them to compete.
That's nature. Compete or die.
And allowed for the expansion of flights between the UAE and Australia. While this was all happening in the international market, domestically, Virgin Blue was launched in 2000. Initially launched as a low-cost carrier by Richard Branson and Brett Godfrey. Godfrey was the Australian CFO of Virgin Atlantic. This new airline got gifted a wide open market when Ansett Australia collapsed in 2001. They quickly grew into a pretty major player in the domestic market. Qantas reacted by launching Jetstar in 2003. This was headed by Alan Joyce and competed directly with Virgin Blue in the low-cost carrier space, allowing Qantas to continue to operate a more premium domestic airline brand. Jetstar was a roaring success. It by no means destroyed Virgin Blue, but it definitely hampered their growth and ability to seriously impact the Qantas premium domestic brand. 2008 rolls around and the Qantas Group needed a new CEO. At the time, the two frontrunners were John Borghetti, the executive in charge of the premium Qantas brand, and Alan Joyce, the head of Jetstar. As we all know now, Alan Joyce got the job. Borghetti would leave 8 months later.
Lovely talking to you. Bye-bye.
But before he left, in what would be considered his final act, he unveiled a code-sharing agreement between Etihad Airways and Qantas. It wasn't too broad in nature, only really covering Etihad's services to Abu Dhabi and a few Middle Eastern cities, but it did include code-sharing on a range of Qantas domestic services. It was a small move that would prove to be pivotal a couple of years later. In 2010, shortly after leaving Qantas, Borghetti would become the CEO of Virgin Blue.
Yeah, speaking of the next 10 years, John, you've got a little bit of work to do, I think, ahead of you. I'm sure the regulators will help you some stage. Anyway.
He was a man on a mission at this point and was tasked with turning the airline into a middle market competitor to the premium Qantas brand. This would be an incredibly expensive task, but Borghetti had a chip on his shoulder and was up for the challenge. Shortly after taking up the CEO role, he received a call from Etihad CEO James Hogan.
Look, I'm getting a call.
Did he want to consider a commercial tie-up between Virgin and Etihad? He did. After a short meeting in Singapore, Etihad and Virgin struck a fairly broad code-sharing agreement that was followed up by an equity investment in 2012. Etihad bought 10% of Virgin.
I own 10%.
Sounds familiar. Qantas, of course, lobbied against this investment. They tried to get Canberra to block the deal. Emirates was not exactly happy about this too. Etihad was their main competitor in the region at the time, and they also just happened to have a code-sharing agreement with Virgin Blue dating back to 2006. It was similar in nature to the Etihad Qantas one. It mostly involved using Virgin Blue as connector traffic for Emirates flights. Of course, Emirates didn't want to be in a three-way tie-up with Etihad and Virgin Blue. Qantas at this point was struggling internationally. They'd been losing money on all of their routes to Europe and suffering from an onslaught of competition from Emirates, Etihad, Singapore Airlines, and more. Now, they also had to worry about Virgin Blue domestically, as they now had the financial backing from the bottomless pit that was Etihad. Just for context, in the early 2000s, Qantas's international capacity was roughly split in thirds. 1/3 to Europe, 1/3 to Asia, and 1/3 to the US. By the time 2012 rolled around, Europe was less than 8%, over 50% of the capacity went to Asia, and the rest went to the US. They just couldn't compete on their own on services to Europe. Hence, the perfect partnership was starting to appear. Emirates had lost their feeder traffic from Virgin, Qantas needed help in Europe, and so, on the 6th of September 2012, Qantas and Emirates announced their new partnership. It was more than just a code-share deal. Qantas moved its hub for European flights to Dubai, and the two companies would also engage in a deep integration of networks with coordination in pricing, sales, and scheduling. Neither of them would take equity stakes in each other, but in a way, this sort of ensured that it was truly a partnership of equals. Neither was buying a chunk of each other, and so, in a way, neither of them owned each other.
You might be wondering why Qantas did a deal with Emirates and not Qatar in 2012. Firstly, Qatar didn't join oneworld until 2013, so that natural sort of alliance relationship wasn't yet formed. And Qatar wasn't quite firing on all cylinders like they are today. They'd only just started flying to Australia in 2009 with a service to Melbourne. And then in 2012, when this Qantas Emirates deal was being done, that's when they started serving the second city in Australia, Perth. They didn't serve Sydney until 2016, and then they didn't end up serving Brisbane until 2020. The slow rollout of these services mostly came down to that air services agreement. The caps had been slowly increased from 7 up to 14 to 21 and then 28. But essentially back in 2012, they didn't have anywhere near the brand value or network quality that Emirates had. It would have been a significantly riskier bet for Qantas to partner with Qatar at that point, especially rehubbing to Doha back in 2012. They didn't have the really fancy Hamad International Airport that they have today. So it just wasn't anywhere near as safe a bet as partnering with Emirates. I also think that Alan Jones and the CEO of Qatar at the time, Akbar Al-Baker, just never really saw eye to eye. Akbar is an incredibly outspoken guy, and he just says some pretty outlandish stuff.
According to IATA figures, that's the lowest representation of women.
Well, of course, it has to be led by a man, because it is a very challenging position. And I'm sure that Alan will agree.
So Akbar said he was going to stop saying controversial things. He lasted 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Either way, the deal with Emirates reinvigorated the international arm of Qantas and turned the chronically loss-making part of the airline into a pretty sustainably profitable leg of the company. Without endlessly repeating history, Virgin would go on to continually lose money throughout the 2010s. They would take investment from Etihad, but also take investments from Singapore and Air New Zealand. Borghetti's attempt to transform Virgin from a low-cost carrier into a more fully fledged premium carrier that could compete with Qantas ultimately failed. I think it was a case of trying to do too much too quickly and also just having too many cooks in the kitchen.
Too many cooks, too many cooks.
I can't imagine the sort of headaches he had dealing with the conflicting interests of Etihad, Singapore Airlines, and Air New Zealand. Bain went on to purchase the airline out of bankruptcy in 2020, and Jane Herdlichka, the former Qantas executive, the former head of Jetstar, would go on to turn the airline around, right-sizing it, downsizing it, and returning it to profitability. So here we are today. Virgin is lean, they're ready to grow again, they're ready to fight again. Are we going to see Qantas versus Virgin round 2? This time backed by Qatar Airways. Who really knows?
Nobody knows.
But I guess we can speculate a little bit. Obviously, Bain is a private equity firm. They eventually want to get their money out. They've reportedly been looking at re-IPOing the airline. I think this will happen in the next couple of years. But this deal with Qatar lets them take some of their money off the table, and it also sort of bolsters the airline. It'll definitely make it look more appealing to investors.
They are actually hot.
So all around, I think this is a great deal for Bain. For Qatar, obviously, they just want to expand their presence in Australia, and so this is sort of a strong-armed way of doing that. But longer term, who really knows? In the press release, it was made clear, and I'll just get this right, that this move will allow Virgin Australia to assess the longer-term merits and viability of wide-body aircraft flying. I guess this is a more measured and risk-free approach to expanding the airline. It'll be interesting to see if Virgin Australia will start flying to places like the US and Asia again. Will Qatar be wet leasing them the jets to do this? Or will they start acquiring their own wide-body jets and getting their own pilots and cabin crew to do this? Who really knows? It's probably likely all down to Qatar Airways, to be honest. Do they want to push Virgin to compete with Qantas head on? Or do they just want them to be a nice, sort of conservative, profitable, small airline? And is it truly just about Qatar Airways getting that sort of access into and out of Australia? Who knows? We first have to see if this investment and these wet leasing deals will be approved by the relevant regulatory bodies. But if they are, then I think we're in for a pretty interesting next decade of Australian aviation. I'm interested to know what you guys think about this. Do you think this is going to be terrible for Qantas? Do you think this will be great for Virgin Australia? Do you like Qatar Airways? Do you think this is overall a good thing? Do you think it'll pass the regulatory bodies? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm interested in your guys' opinions. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out flightformula.com. Go subscribe to Wine Tracker Plus. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye. It is starting to rain. I gotta get out of here.
$6. My God.